Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we'll be talking about aquatic food production. So if you're hungry for a discussion on seafood, this is the episode for you. We'll discuss catching and farming our seafood, as well as feeding global appetites both now and in the future. So grab your knife and fork as we tuck into this delicious topic. Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty, your host, and I'm so excited to introduce my two guests. Julie Bremner is an ecologist who specialises in the marine environment. She's particularly interested in how different parts of our environment fit together and how we can live sustainably within ecosystems. Grant Stentiford is the Chief Scientist at the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. His work's focused on the identification and impact of aquatic animal diseases in both farmed and wild environments. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Great for you to be here. So we've mentioned a couple of those topics in the biography, and I wanted to first start off talking about seafood and the difference between seafood and aquatic food.
So seafood is something probably a lot of us are familiar with. So that describes animals and plants that we take from the sea to eat. So in the UK, that would be things like cod and prawns, tuna, sea bass, all the things that we like to eat from the sea. We also take food from freshwater, so from rivers and from lakes. So that could be eels or salmon, spend quite a lot of their time in rivers. And aquatic food simply means food that's taken from any water body. So it might be from a river, it might be from a lake, or it could be from the sea.
And in terms of how that food is cultivated or captured, can you go into a few different examples?
Then there's many different ways that we can get our food from aquatic water bodies. So we can grow our food. So we have aquaculture, where we grow animals and plants in rivers, in lakes and at the coast. But we also have what we call wild capture, so capture fisheries. So that's people going out on boats and catching animals from the environment.
So how has that evolved over time and how has it changed?
So capture fisheries are something that human beings have been doing for a very, very, very long time. In archaeology digs, they find evidence in the middens and the waste mounds, they find fish bones. So, or shells from shellfish. So it's something that we've been doing for a very long time, is taking our food from the sea, from rivers or from lakes. And it's important culturally, important economically for coastal communities. There's very strong, in the UK, for example, in many countries, there's very strong coastal communities whose livelihoods depend on capturing animals and plants from the sea, and who, there's whole history around it, there's traditions around it, there's sea shanties around doing this kind of stuff. So it's very strong and very important. So in the past, the population of the world was certainly a lot smaller than it is now. So there were lots of fish in the sea and not so many people trying to eat them. As populations have grown, then the pressure on the food stock of the fish stocks in the sea has increased. And in some places we've seen problems. Primarily, most of our fish stocks in the world are sustainably fished, so are fished in a way that we can ensure that they remain there for future generations. Some stocks do have problems, so we start to see that the size of the human population creates a problem for us for eating fish from the sea. So we have to think about other ways that we can produce that same protein to feed people, which is where aquaculture comes in.
Julie's given us a nice overview of some of the traditional and more technological advances in fishing. Can you go into a bit more detail of farming our aquatic food?
Yeah, sure. So I think Julie's given a really good summary there of where the global population has got to. I mean, there's a growing global population, maybe reaching sort of over 9 billion by mid-century, 2050. So as well as there being more people out there, the other sort of interesting trend that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is that the amount of aquatic food that people eat has also increased. So it's been steadily creeping up since about the 60s. And now it's around about 20 kilos per person per year. So for every person on Earth, roughly about 20 kilos are being consumed. Now, obviously, there's a lot of variation within that. Some countries a lot more, some countries a lot less. But that's the global average. So to sort of keep up with that demand for seafood as a sort of healthy form of protein, nutritious food, aquaculture, which is the growing of fish, shellfish and seaweeds in water, has sort of stepped in, I guess, to boost up some of the amounts of aquatic food we're going to need. And aquaculture is now done all over the world. We've reached a point where around about half of all the aquatic food consumed globally, 50% of all that 20 kilos consumed is now from aquaculture. The other thing since the 1960s is that aquaculture is really considered now to be the fastest growing of the food sectors generally. That includes those on land as well, because fish and shellfish and seaweeds grow relatively efficiently. They're cold-blooded, they live in water, they don't support their body weight like animals on land do. So there's lots of efficiencies that are built into aquatic food production that aquaculture is trying to look to develop and look to make that a food source.
Wow, fascinating. That's great. So we've got this big demand you've both spoken about, the need to feed people. So what do we need to consider or think about when we want to produce food from water?
So I think, Julie mentioned earlier on about, the sustainable management of fisheries is really very front and centre to most governments who manage their waterways. Is a really important thing to be able to do because, regardless of aquaculture's increase, fisheries are still going to be a really important part of how we get our food into the future. So that sustainable management has to be there. It has to be done. And aquaculture, I think, is looking at that and thinking to itself, well, it also needs a set of metrics, sustainability metrics, which are going to make sure it can be produced as well. We don't want to just create a...
Sorry, the jargon alarm's gone off there. Could you explain what a sustainability metric is?
Yeah, sustainability metrics that we talk about there are looking at sort of what type of things we would like to see built into any food sector to ensure that we are doing it sustainably. Can we still be doing it in the future for our future generations the way we do it now? So we're looking to see which things we'd like to see built into that sector, whether it's fisheries or aquaculture, may relate to the environment, may relate to the animals themselves, or may relate to the people who would get the products in the end. Sustainability has to go right across that whole space. And aquaculture, I think, it needs to really look now to filling that gap for aquatic food production in the future that we know is going to be there as there's more people and they're eating more aquatic food. But it needs to do so in a way that doesn't damage the environment unduly, and it makes sure that actually the food that is produced from that sector does get to the people who need it, doesn't create problems for welfare for the animals grown in that system. So those kind of metrics are what I mean by sustainability built into our design, if you like, of those food production systems.
Perfect. Thank you for explaining that. So you've talked about lots of components that are all working in unison. Is there a term that is used to collate everything, all these working components and bits of the cogs of the wheel, as it were?
So we've been working a lot on broad principles of how do we bring all these factors together. It's a very sort of simple thing to say of sustainability to be built into these systems. It needs to be for any food system. And we've been looking at principles of a system called One Health to see whether we can actually align that approach to, in this case, the growing of food in water or the growing of any food. Think about those metrics I mentioned and what are they and how do we make sure they're built into aquaculture production in terms of the research and evidence we may need, but also what policies and what legislation may need to be built into aquaculture production in a given country to ensure that we're trying to hit those sustainability targets we've got for the sector.
One Health is this overarching approach where everything's kind of interlinked, and I think I'm struggling to understand how we apply this to food production. So Julie, would you be able to help guide me in visualising what that kind of looks like?
Yeah, it's a really big concept.
Yeah.
That this idea of One Health being animal and plant health, human health and environmental health. It's huge, right? It's a big ball of ideas stuck together. And I guess bringing it back to the concept of sustainability, it ties very closely with that, because sustainability is about economic sustainability, environmental sustainability and social sustainability. Every human being, every animal, every plant gets what they need out of the situation. So when we think about applying that to food production, then we have to think about, how do we produce food? Where do we produce food? Who produces food? Where that food production is taking place? What are the environments where that food production is taking place? What's the biodiversity there? What are the people like who are living there? Where are things happening, and how does the production of the food affect the world around it? And indeed, how does the world around it affect the production of food as well? How does the world affect the safety of food? These One Health ideas, applying them to food, mean that we need to think about food in terms of money, the finances generated by food and how much it costs to produce food, how much it costs to buy food and to consume food, the environment that the food takes place in, so what is the biodiversity there, are there climate issues that we need to think about when producing food? Indeed, are there climate issues that impact on our ability to produce food? What's the nutrition of food? How nutritious is it?
It's a lot to get your head around. It's a lot to get your head around.
It is a lot to get your head around. So it's taking these concepts of animal and plant health, environmental health and human health and applying them to every part of the process of producing food and thinking about what are the implications of producing food for all of that health at every stage.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So many moving parts, so much at every stage you're considering all of those things. So in practical terms, how can we do that? How can we make this concept a reality? It must be very challenging.
So we've been looking to see how, in practical terms, we can apply these One Health, these broad principles to food production. In our case, applied to aquaculture, because it's a sector that we're familiar with. We think it's going to increase and need this built in. Julie's mentioned some of the ways those interactions happen. I think, what we need to consider is, at the moment, if we looked at the metrics that we mentioned there, all the 15 or 20 things we'd like to see, I guess the honesty of that is that at the moment, several of those metrics are not in place for many of these sectors, but we'd like to see them put in place. But by taking a One Health approach, it's just a very useful checklist to understand, have we sort of achieved the One Health metrics for the animals and plants being grown, for the environment that it's existing within, and for the people who may get their hands on these products and the money generated from them in the end. To test, really, in each of those metrics, do we have the evidence we need? Are there researchers looking into some of those aspects, or is it just something that's in the future? Have we generated any evidence that we could make sensible decisions on the back of? And if so, is there any policy in place, for instance, for ensuring that there is gender equality in aquaculture, or that we're protecting water quality, or we've got animal health metrics sorted? Is that policy being adequately applied and consistently applied in the sectors we know exist in our own waterways? And is there legislation in place to help that happen? And I think by looking at all of that together and testing those individual metrics that are around that sort of One Health wheel, then we can sort of take an honest approach and say, well, actually, for several of the metrics, we haven't got that in place yet, and we'd like it to be in place. So there's a good focus there for researchers and for policymakers to really focus in and improve upon some of those metrics. So it's a very useful checklist that we'd like to see built in, but there is work to be done to make that happen.
What are the challenges associated with making that checklist happen, Julie?
It is simple in theory. It is not simple in reality. Grant's talked about the policy challenges associated with it and finding ways to generate policy that encompasses all of these big issues that we're talking about. But one of the other major challenges that we have is that when we're talking about all these many different issues, we're talking about many different specialisms, people coming from many different parts of society. We're talking about scientists, we're talking about the industry, so we large food producers, small stakeholder farmers. There's a huge number of people in the conversation, and they all speak a different language. Not in terms of whether they're speaking English or French or another language, but in terms of the words they use to describe their priorities, in terms of the words they use to describe what they're doing, in terms of the words they use to describe what food is. So we all use these different words, possibly talking about the same things, but coming at it in very different ways. For us to be able to get everyone into this conversation, there's a real challenge around finding language that everyone understands, finding a narrative that everyone can agree with. And people coming from very different viewpoints often don't agree. So it is a huge challenge.
If everybody's involved in the conversation, everybody's being considered, then everyone's at the table and everyone can work together to make it happen. But that's not necessarily an easy thing to do because you've got to get everyone together in the first place. Is this a global initiative done on a small scale and then scaled up? Or how is it working?
Yeah, It's both, actually, Kirsty. It's some food production takes place very locally, a smallholder farmer in their back garden. But at the other end of the scale, food is produced, and in our increasingly globalised world, leaving aside the glitch we went through with the pandemic, in our increasingly globalised world, food is traded around the world. So food is produced in one country, it may be processed in a different country, packaged in a different country, and then sold somewhere else.
Wow.
So these are both local issues and global issues. So we have to find the means to be able to have that conversation across those different levels.
Wow. Grant, have you got any possible solutions? That we've talked a lot about the challenges, but are there solutions to these kind of issues?
So I think that Julie mentioned that complexity in this, and if you asked most governments of most countries who looks after the food production and supply to people, multiple departments across a government in terms of responsibilities for that, the health of people, the use of the environment to create that food, the protection of the environment to make sure it's safe enough and clean enough to produce the food, etc., are often in different parts of the government. And some of the challenges with One Health is a very simple concept, but it's to try to make sure that the various departments, the various responsible authorities, if you like, that look after that are actually talking. And one of the ways of doing that, to simplify, is that the good thing about this is that food is a very common denominator. It's a thing that people understand. Everyone eats food. It's a good starting place for a conversation just amongst people, regardless of which part of that system they come from. So that's a very useful way of starting it. It's quite a simple outcome we're looking for. And then it's a case of working backwards from there. And quite often the structures of government and the structures of the way we work together are not really in place, rather than the principle is a difficult one to get your head around. So a lot of the conversations in One Health, and in this case applied to food systems generally, are around different groups talking together who didn't previously talk together. And we've got some good examples of that within say, COVID, which is a very One Health issue. We know that COVID exists as a pathogen, disease that lands in a particular community, but the way it interacts with that community depends on the social status of the community, how well fed they are, their age, their demographics, etc. So that's a really good example of One Health, where you may also need to bring in wildlife specialists to understand where those pathogens came from, the habits of people, why it came into the human community. So the vets and the medics are very familiar with One Health. But what we're thinking about here is bringing that One Health thinking much more into those people who work on food systems. And organisations such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, a big UN level body, are really starting to now think about how to build those One Health principles into their work they do in multiple countries. So food systems are at the start of this journey, but I think they're going to absolutely have to go down this route as well, of working across these multiple policy and community and NGO and academic and societal sectors to really get new thinking about food systems, because they really rely on the environment. All food comes from our environment, and the environment must be able to supply that into the future. So new ways of thinking about it across government and organisations.
Yeah, and this is the really interesting thing about this One Health approach to food. For some of the environmental problems that we talk about in the world, they're perhaps affecting certain groups more than others. So there's differences in interest in them, across the world. For some societal problems, they affect some groups more than others. Everybody eats food. Everybody needs food. So everybody has, let's say, a skin in the game. And this is although it is a massive challenge, this is where there's this opportunity to really bring this group together, because everybody has a viewpoint. If you're an environmentalist, you're concerned about protection of your environment. I'm an ecologist. I'm concerned about the marine environment staying nice for future generations. But I need to eat, and I have to eat something. So it has this way of bringing the opportunity to bring everyone together, because everybody will want to express a view on it. So although there may be difficulties in finding the way to express that view, everybody can engage in the idea.
Yeah. Sounds like you've got a real hunger for it. It's great to hear you guys talking about it. So I guess I wanted to come back to the marine environment you mentioned there, and you've gone through an example we're all familiar with, which was the COVID pandemic. But is there an example you can go into that's a bit closer to the marine environment that we can really visualise that this is already kind of happening in and being considered in a particular species or area or marine environment example, in an example in aquaculture perhaps, and how using this very conceptual approach practically and applying it.
So I think there's some really good examples within aquaculture already that if you were to do a sort of deep dive into those sectors and have a look at how, seaweed farming is going, or how bivalve mollusks, or the sort of shellfish aquaculture, we may well find that actually quite a few of those metrics I mentioned earlier are being quite well achieved in some of those sectors. They're creating really good quality food with high omega-3s. They're filter feeding in the environment, so they're not being fed, and the products are being sold for good profit to create wealth and food for the local communities that grow them. So there's some good examples there where One Health is already quite apparent actually within some of these sectors. There are other sectors within aquaculture being criticised in terms of their sustainability. We are going to need a variation of products coming from aquaculture. We're not all going to eat one thing. So we expect there to be lots of different species grown. So everything from your salmon to your bivalve shellfish to your seaweeds and so on, because that's what creates an enjoyable, healthy diet that people need. But I think what we're seeing in aquaculture is maybe more of a One Health approach, is where certain sectors start combining with each other and integrated form of growing. So there are examples where, for instance, seaweed will be grown on the same sites as fish, and some of the wastes or nutrients which are coming from those farms are being absorbed and taken up by the seaweeds that are then grown and used for products or consumption, or even where those seaweeds are being used for other uses, for instance, in animal feeds on land to reduce methane output. So where we start combining these sectors together, I think we've got a much better chance of trying to achieve these metrics around the One Health model that we've talked about.
So it's like you're farming an ecosystem. There's a bit of every product and it's reflecting the system that it came from.
Yeah, and that's a practical example from Grant there on how these concepts are being used in the real world, because they are quite theoretical, aren't they? But we are actually finding ways to apply them in the real world. There's the opportunity to create tools that can visualize these different elements so that we can make informed choices about the food and how we produce it. So hazards that might impact on food production could be pathogens, could be pollution. If you've got a fish farm, there's all sorts of hazards that can impact on the production of food. Then the production of food can generate hazards that impact on the environment. So we can develop tools that allow us to, let's say, make a score for each of these hazards, so we can compare all the different hazards against each other and identify what are the biggest problems in the food system, and then take action to reduce those problems, or hopefully mitigate them completely. And indeed, we might be able to take action that allows us to, if thinking about the environment, take action that allows us to use food production to make a better environment. So there's work there and opportunities to create tools to visualise, to measure and to visualise these metrics so that we can trade them off against each other and decide which hazards, which impacts of food production we want to deal with and how to deal with them.
So it's almost like the whole process of One Health, all these tools are being developed that people can refer to, is almost like a recipe book. Would that be fair, or is that kind of a reach? I'm going to open up the discussion to either of you.
Yeah, right, so that's an interesting analogy, isn't it, with your recipe.
Yeah,
so
I'm not a specialist in the subject, can you tell?
It's a good one, and it links well to food, doesn't it? So this is a really interesting analogy. So in this example, the hazards then are like the ingredients. So it could be, okay, so how much pollution can we have in the system? End point is how nice is the cake, and that's how well we're producing food. But the big question is the instructions for what to do with the ingredients, isn't it? Right? So that's the space that we're in. We think we know what the ingredients are, but we've got a long way to go. We know what some ingredients are, so we know what some challenges are around producing food. We don't know all of them, so we need a longer ingredients list. But then we need to get to what to do with the ingredients. And that's, I suppose, a bit of the centre of it for me. What are we going to do with these ingredients in order to make that really nice cake?
I mean, the instruction manual is actually the policies, isn't it? That requires then in priority setting, what do we tackle first? And the key thing really, I think for me, is that we've got to really reduce down those losses and wastes in any food system, and that includes aquaculture, sort of optimizing those successes at the end of it. So I think it's control of those key hazards and then prioritizing them that's massively important.
Yeah, I think that's a central point. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, so they are the food experts globally, consider that if we can reduce food loss and waste, then we can adequately feed the global population. Now, aside with that, means that if we can reduce food loss and waste, we can produce food better in the space that we have, which also has environmental benefits and it has social benefits. So this is a really key point, and it's a key point of this One Health approach to food production is how do we do food better in the same or a smaller space.
Okay, so we've gone over aquaculture quite a lot in this discussion, and I think I'd like to bring it back to fisheries, because that's something that we talked about in the very beginning of the episode, and I just wanted to understand how in this big, I think we've got some really good examples in aquaculture that we've talked about and in farming our foods, so how does wild capture and other inputs into the food system fit into this puzzle that we've got?
I forget who wrote this quote, but everything is connected. You know, you may be familiar with the Gaia concept of this world as a large ecosystem. Everything is connected into it, and food production is connected as well. So, in some places we capture fish to produce fish meal for aquaculture. So those two food sectors are connected together. In other places we collect or farm seaweed to produce fertiliser to be used on cropland to produce crops. So even though we might not be aware of it on looking at it, food sectors are connected together. And of course, the hazards associated with them are connected together as well. If you're putting fertiliser onto farmland to help with your crop growth, that fertiliser will go into the soil. It will then go into the river, and it will then move downstream to the coast. So these environments are connected, so the challenges and the hazards associated with food production are also connected. So we will never have a global food system where food will only be produced in one way, because it wouldn't work for everyone. So fisheries is part of the answer to feeding humanity into the future in the same way that aquaculture is. The trick is to get those two things producing together, understand the links between those two food sectors, and then understanding how we can better use them both together to produce the food that we need.
So you could say one world, one health, one food.
One food, yes.
Yes, I think, when we go shopping, we fill our trolleys and baskets with a load of foods from completely different sectors without even thinking about it. And I think that's the critical bit, because all of those foods have an impact, and we've got to try to bring these principles of more efficient production into all of those sectors, and hopefully simultaneously. And I think by taking a more of a one food approach, where you understand what the interaction is between aquaculture and fisheries, but between also fisheries and land-based production of anything and so on, is going to become critical. And I think those are the conversations that are now starting to be had with the departments, governments, sectors which are responsible for producing them, because they know that the success of their individual sectors are very reliant on the successes of other sectors in which they interact with. And Julie's given some good examples already of where hazards which may come down a river system and cause problems for a fish farm may indirectly cause increased pressure on another part of the food sector if that fish farming sector fails. So I think we have to understand how these food sectors interact and look at them in the round and start conversing about them being in the round, and not necessarily singling one out as sustainable or not. I think, it's always been a bit of a principle of the One Health approach, and certainly the One Food approach, if we call it that now, that an individual sector cannot be deemed sustainable on its own. It must be considered how sustainable it is in relation to its role in the whole food system, because that's how people shop and that's how people will continue to consume.
So I think we're coming to the end of our episode now, and we've gone over some really big concepts, some really interesting research, and my mind feels completely blown. So that's really thanks to you guys and explaining some of the concepts we talked about today. So usually at the end of the episode, we finish with a fun fact, something that someone can take to a party about One Health.
What we haven't talked very much about is plants. With many people turning towards plant-based diets, this is quite an interesting topic area, and particularly, how does that sector look like in food production? So I just wanted to leave you with this one. For our UK listeners, you might have heard of the big five. That's the 5 seafood species that we like to eat in the UK. So that's cod, haddock, salmon, tuna, and prawns. Most of our listeners will probably, unless they're vegetarian, will have tasted at least one of these on the list there. But did you know that there are approximately 300,000 edible plants in the world, and we eat only 200 of them? So that's 0.07% of the edible plants available to us on the sea and on land. We only eat 200.
Wow.
Yeah, it's all a matter of balance. Some of those species of plants will be rarer than others, and some will be more common. But there's opportunities there.
Opportunities, exactly. Perfect. Over to you now, Grant.
Yeah, that was a good fact. I mean, one of the other things I like to tell people as well is that seafood, aquatic food, is complex. We talked a lot about the combination between doing it, growing it, making it, catching it, and how we consume it. And in the UK, I mentioned earlier on, we're about an average consumer globally. We eat about 20 kilos or so of fish and shellfish and aquatic food generally every single year. And the interesting thing about that is everything we pretty much consume within the UK doesn't come from the UK. So we are mainly an importing nation for seafood, even though we live on an island.
Wow, thank you. They're really making me think today, both of you. Well, thank you so much for speaking to me today about this really amazing topic. So interesting and forward-thinking as well. I think everyone will have enjoyed listening to some of the concepts that are helping to mould the future of our food production. And I think many of us will be in the supermarket thinking about some of the topics we've talked about today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.